So, hi everyone. I'm happy to welcome you to the second day of our conference, which is the third Ukrainian Studies in Prague conference. And we are moving towards the next panel, which would be focused on the Ukrainian literature in Russian Empire and in the Soviet Union. And I'm very happy to introduce to you the chair of the first panel, who is my colleague from the Department of East European Studies at Charles University, Dr. Tereza Chlaňová. She is a well-known person in the Czech academic circles dealing with Slavistics. Tereza is the head of the Czech Association of Ukrainian Studies. She was a member of the committee giving the Visegrad Eastern Partnership Literary Award. Dr. Chlaňová is a prolific academic and a renowned translator, having translated in Czech important works of Ukrainian poets and writers, including Vasil Stus, Vasil Holoborodko, Yuri Vinnichuk, and others. On top of that, Tereza has supervised a number of brilliant doctoral studies at the department. Tereza, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Valeria. And I thank you especially for the possibility to be here and to join this inspiring conference. And to move on, I would like to present our first speaker, but unfortunately it will not be a speaker because Oksana Pachlovska, who was supposed to be with us today, is out of the program personally. Unfortunately, for some unexpected circumstances, she can't be here with us today. But she sent us her paper, so we will read it for you. But before I start reading it, I would like to introduce her for you and say a few words about Oksana. So Oksana Pachlovska studied Italian language and literature in Moscow University. She is the author of dozens of studies on Ukrainian and European literature, and she is the author of the book Ave Europa, which gained the Shevchenko National Prize, which, as we know, is the highest state prize of Ukraine for works of culture and arts. And now Oksana Pachlovska is a professor at the Faculty of Literature and Philosophy at Sapienza University in Italian Rome. Before I start reading her paper, I would like to ask all of our audience to write not questions, but comments on Oksana Pachlovska's paper. And after Oksana Pachlovska and our second speaker, Mykola Riabchuk, will present his paper, we will deal with those comments and we will deal with the questions. So please write down questions, write down comments in chat, and we will summarize it at the end of the papers. So this is important part of the discussion. So please be free to fill the chat gaps there. And now to move on, I will start reading Oksana's paper. First, she wrote a short letter to the audience of this panel, of this conference, so I will read this as well. Dear friends and colleagues, unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, I will not be able to join the conference. Please accept my apologies for any inconvenience caused. I wish you a productive discussion. Best wishes, Oksana Pachlovska. And now the title of her paper, which is The Destruction of European Ukraine, How Imperial and Soviet Strategies Alienated Literature from Society, Concepts, Mechanisms, Outcomes. Compared to other literatures in Eastern Europe, Ukrainian literature has faced and still faces several more obstacles in terms of creating, interpreting, and innovating its canon. In particular, any attempts to assert the complete autonomy of Ukrainian culture and literature from political circumstances ultimately turn out to be artificial, since literature is the product of language and thus one of the basic sources of a nation's identity. It is not sufficient to have great writers. Instead, as suggested by French historian François Guizot, it is rather the reception and level of critical understanding of such great writers that determine societal progress. Therefore, the historical contextualization in which the process of creating literature takes place is a complex set of problems that have to be periodically revised in the light of new developments. The annotation to the recently published volume on the history of Ukraine in Italy emphasizes the attempt to consider the history of Ukraine not from a traditional perspective, whether Polish or Russian, but rather from a Ukrainian perspective. My argument is that such Ukrainian perspective must first of all have European connotations. It is important to stress that in examining the European nature of Ukrainian literature, the focus is not on various literary genres and trends, but on key philosophical concepts. With this in mind, Europe is here considered not as a continent, but as a philosophical category, a system of values. A world in which the founding principles of democracy have evolved from ancient Athens in the 5th century BC to the national movements of the 19th century, a world which has directly influenced the formative of Slavic cultures. Europe versus non-Europe. Today, Ukrainian culture is experiencing a profound crisis as it has entered a period of historical turbulence, revealing both the positive and negative aspects of the paradoxes underlying its development. The country, which a few years ago seemed to be moving confidently towards Europe, has once again stopped at a crossroads. After two Maidans, 24 and 2013-2014, it seemed that the country had thrown off the shackles of the past and irreversibly chosen to embark on a path towards European integration. But both processes were interrupted by a combination of external interference and internal factors. Thus, the return of Soviet ghosts in the form of presidential candidates such as Viktor Yanukovych and Volodymyr Zelensky can no longer be viewed as simply the result of Russia's retaliation against Ukraine's westward leanings. As a matter of fact, these Soviet ghosts signal the continued presence of deeply ingrained stereotypes and priorities within Ukrainian society which hinder the country's path towards Europe. At the same time, Ukraine's paradoxes appear to be almost minor in comparison to the situation in countries such as Hungary, Czech Republic, and Poland. In this regard, it is important to mention Milan Kundera's article, A Kidnapped West, or the tragedy of Central Europe. In this article, written in 1984, on the eve of perestroika, Kundera drew a clear demarcation line between what he viewed as Europe and non-Europe. While referring to the 1956 uprising in Budapest, he argued that dying on the barricades for freedom and for Europe was possible only in Budapest, Prague, and Warsaw, thus ruling out Moscow and then Leningrad. In other words, Kundera saw the entire Soviet Union as a continuation of Russia, the embodiment of a boundless Eastern, Asian identity, in which the feeling of freedom in either a cultural or political sense could never take root. This demarcation line corresponded to the division of the Eastern European world between Western and Eastern Christianity. Therefore, the Czech writer did not separate Ukraine from what in his eyes appeared to be a homogeneous space of anti-European orthodoxy. Nonetheless, the events in recent years have contradicted Kundera's theoretical presumptions. Previously considered as models of democratization in Eastern Europe, these three countries have shown strong anti-European tendencies, Poland, or openly anti-European and pro-Russian attitudes, Hungary and Czech Republic. By contrast, the 2014 events in Kyiv echoed the uprisings of Budapest in 1956 and Prague in 1968. The only difference, perhaps, is that Russian tanks stopped short of the capital, remaining in Crimea and Donbass. Although this is an oversimplification, this scheme is useful for understanding my main argument. In the complex processes underlying the formation of national identities in Eastern Europe, and in the Slavic region in particular, Europe has a significant role as a cultural reference point, a socio-political model, and a horizon of civilizational belonging. The paradoxes of Ukraine's cultural evolution. Each Slavic culture, in one way or another, compares itself with Europe while feeling part of either the Western or Eastern space. Here it is worth mentioning an interesting perspective developed in the context of Slavic studies in Italy. In practice, the division of the Slavic world into its Western and Eastern, Catholic and Orthodox, Latin and Greek regions is seen as the result of the division of the Roman Empire into its Western and Eastern parts. In other words, the Slavic world inherited the cultural antagonism between the First and Second Rome, between Rome and Constantinople. Significantly, such antagonism only deepened at a time when seemingly religious divisions should be weakened under the influence of secularization practices and experiences. Instead, today precisely divisions along religious lines have become even more accentuated while influencing the cultural and political dimension of international relations. Against this background, in an age of new divisions, Ukraine found itself in an extremely difficult situation. Following the theory above, Ukraine is not just a hybrid culture, as any other Slavic country is, but rather a pan-European synthesis. As a matter of fact, despite its historical affiliation with the Slavic Byzantine tradition, Ukrainian culture has developed at the crossroads of various Western influences. The latter are, of course, the subject not of literary, but of political discussions between Russia and the West around Ukraine. There are several paradoxes in the history of Ukrainian culture which have complicated the creation of a Ukrainian canon. The first paradox dates back to medieval times. In the Middle Ages, Kyiv was the origin of the cultural development of ancient Rus. But the symbol of Rus as the cradle of Russia provoked countless cultural and political discussions, where Russia reserved exclusively for Ukraine and Russia the status of members of the Russian world, mainly on the basis of the crucial role of orthodoxy. The second paradox dates back to the period of the Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth and the Baroque. Then the legacy of ancient Rus split into two opposite segments. The first segment, Northern Rus, especially Muscovy, from the beginning of the Tatar-Mongol invasion and almost until the reign of Peter I, had received two Eastern influences, a socio-political from the Golden Horde and a cultural one from Byzantium. By contrast, the second segment, namely Southern Western Rus, that is, territories largely corresponding to Ukraine and Belarus, together known as Ruthenia, was mainly exposed to Western influences. First, the Lithuanian-Polish conquest, and later the entry into the Commonwealth contributed to the transformation of Ukrainian culture into a pan-European synthesis. In fact, Orthodox literature was developed not only in Old Church Slavonic language, but also in Latin and Polish, while the Greek Catholic Church, with its own cultural tradition, started to emerge alongside the Orthodox Church. This was the origin of the phenomenon of Catholic Rus. Essentially, a special type of orthodoxy had been created in Ukraine, one that was differentiated, inclusive, and open to multicultural influences. The two academies of Ostrog, late 15th century, and Kiev, Orthodox universities, where teaching was held mainly in Latin, became the most prominent manifestations of this cultural synthesis. The fact that Latin became an integral part of Ukrainian culture played a significant role in the country's development, becoming a tool for spreading European ideas. In short, the Ukrainian Baroque was heavily shaped by European influences, although its development was somewhat affected by the non-secularized type of culture within Orthodoxy. These two paradoxes contributed to the formation of a third one. When it comes to the Europeanization of Russia within the framework of Peter I's project, we should actually be talking about two waves of Europeanization, and in fact, Westernization. One wave was humanistic in nature, and it originated from Ukraine's Orthodox Latin heritage. The other wave related to scientific and technological developments derived from the German world. To put it differently, since the reign of Peter I, Ukraine has contributed to the Europeanization of Russia, whereas Russia has facilitated the provincialization and marginalization of Ukraine. The year 1686 can be considered a turning point when the Russian Empire and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth signed the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, which effectively led to the partition of Ukraine. As a result, Ukraine was transferred from the canonical space of the Patriarchate of Constantinople to that of the Moscow Patriarchate, which had profoundly detrimental consequences for its culture. From 1720 onwards, the Ukrainian version of the Old Church Slavonic language, as well as Latin and Polish, were removed from the Ukrainian cultural space through repressive policies to the advantage of the Russian language, which became a tool for the religious and linguistic literary homologation of the country. Already at the time, the idea of an undifferentiated Orthodox world began to be identified with the Russian world. In the 19th century, the Slavic world found itself under the rule of three empires, Russian, Habsburg, and Ottoman. Except for Russia, virtually none of the Slavic countries had its own independent statehood. However, during the Romantic period, all Slavic cultures, in line with Western European ones, experienced a sense of national revival and the search for their national roots and historical cultural legacy. Thanks to Karamzin and the Slavophile tradition, Russian literature was interpreted as a historical continuum from the Middle Ages onwards, on the basis of the Orthodox matrix and the Old Church Slavonic language. The growing ideological division between Ukraine and Russia manifested in all cultural dimensions. First of all, in the religious dimension, the church, as the ideological basis of the Russian Empire, was completely alien to the Ukrainian tradition, where the church had been a proponent of national interests and the ancestors' faith. Thus, another paradoxical turn occurred in Ukrainian culture, the codification of a new literary language, first of all in the works of Ivan Kotlяревsky and Taras Shevchenko on the basis of colloquial language. This new literary language marked the distancing of Ukrainian culture from the Orthodox tradition, the search of completely new ways of cultural self-realization. Similarly, the Western Slavonic nations. But the 19th century also featured the first attempts at writing histories of Ukrainian literature, thus at creating the Ukrainian canon. In the first half of the century, the culture of Cossack Ukraine was largely recuperated, and from the 1860s onwards, in the works of Kulish, Drahomanov, Franco, and others, most efforts were dedicated to the literary heritage from Kievan Rus to the 18th century, from Hilarion to Grigory Skovoroda. This is where the systematic deconstruction of Ukraine's cultural heritage at the hand of the empire began. The entire literary heritage written in the Old Church Slavonic language, with targeted censorship, interventions, and ideological interpretations, started being integrated into the history of Russian literature. Ukrainian literary and historiographical texts, as well as Ukrainian language, were altogether banned. On the basis of these repressive policies, Russian imperial ideologues systematically reserved to Ukraine a place which was at odds with its historical cultural heritage. In the 17th century, the first schools, writers, books, and literary phenomena formed under Western influence came to Muscovy from then Ukraine. In Russia, this dynamic was read in the opposite direction. Bielinski, a westernizer, wrote that the education and culture had reached Ukraine from Russia. The transition of Ukrainian literature to colloquial language was interpreted as the use of dialect. The political status of Ukraine as a province of the empire contributed to the consolidation of the image of Ukrainian culture as a folklore variation of Russian culture. Anything that does not fit into this paradigm was forbidden. The burlesque was allowed, tragedy was not, so to speak. The most severe persecutions targeted Mykola Kostomarov's books of the genesis of the Ukrainian people, the activities of the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, and Taras Shevchenko's poetry. Against this background, it is possible to interpret Ukrainian identity at this time as a radical protest against the empire, thereby placing Slavic peoples in general, and Ukrainians in particular, onto the European horizon, and bringing itself closer to the Polish and Czech Romantic traditions. In other words, during this period, two distinctly European phenomena find their place in Ukrainian culture: the Baroque and Romanticism. This question also applies to the chronologization of Ukrainian literature. From this viewpoint, Russian literature has its origins in ancient Rus, whereas Ukrainian literature originated only in the early 19th century. Interestingly, repressive policies began to change from the 1860s until the eve of the fall of the empire. 1863 is symbolic. The January uprising in Poland coincided with a gradual ban on Ukrainian language, 1863, 1876, 1888. Critically, the ban affected not only literature, but also the schooling system, the press, the theater, church sermons, and even the baptism of children with Ukrainian names. That is, not only was literature alienated from society, but any manifestation of Ukrainianness was marked as a crime against the state, which was to be united and invisible. Jedinaya I nedělímaya. Even the toponym Ukraine was scribbled. A number of Russian intellectuals emphasized its special danger to Russia's integrity as a state. On the eve of World War I, Ukraine was treated in Russian journalism as the main question for the survival of the empire. The Mazepa question hits the empire to the heart. In this new context, any bearer of Ukrainianness was no longer ridiculed as Gogol's beekeeper Rudy Paňko, but was effectively perceived as a potential political criminal. As a result, any literary phenomenon was treated as a political conspiracy. Even folklore seemed dangerous. In turn, this trend radicalized Ukrainian society led to its division between patriots and adeptus, heroes and traitors, modernists and traditionalists, and so on. Over the course of a few decades, Ukraine's identity in Russia's perception had come a long way. From innocent folkloristic entertainment with a mythical and safe past to the formidable destructive power of the empire, which until recently had appeared to be invincible. However, this phenomenon must be placed in a broader context. The maturation of the identity of Slavic peoples who in the first half of the 19th century found their heritage, and in the second half and the turn of the century were choosing their future. And this choice between Western Slavs and Ukrainians was incompatible with Russia's. The Slavic peoples embraced, to varying degrees, the principle of sovereignty and that of belonging to Greater Europe, whereas Russia was wedded to the idea of Greater Russia, a homogeneous space of all Slavs and Europe's antagonists. But Ukraine was punished perhaps even more severely than Poland for leaving Russia, because ultimately Poland was perceived as a clearly foreign reality that Russia would sooner or later lose. By contrast, Orthodox Ukraine was denied any form of otherness, and this otherness itself was subjected to unprecedented censorship and repressive pressure. This problem takes its most complex and dramatic forms in the 20th century. In Ukrainian culture, three macro phenomena developed in the form of modernist currents. Modernism of the 1920s, called the executed Renaissance, roughly 1917-1933, neo-modernism of the 60s, and various forms of modernism in the literature of the diaspora from Prague to Munich to the United States. Significantly, these current phenomena should be considered as part and parcel of European modernism. In other words, during the 20th century, various responses to European literature, art, and philosophy had been formulated in Ukrainian literature. However, Ukrainian society at large has developed a better awareness of this phenomenon only since independence. Ukraine was under Soviet occupation longer than any other East European country, from 1922 to 1991. Of course, the influence of anti-Western ideologues and repressive practices of the Soviet system influenced the cultures of the former Soviet Union as well as the whole of Eastern Europe. But in the Ukrainian context, the modalities were somewhat similar, but also different. Ukrainian cultural history of the 20th century is possibly the richest one in terms of prominent authors and texts. In this regard, despite the tragedy of the century, Ukraine seems to have aligned with the cultural dynamics of other European countries on an equal footing. But all these phenomena were not simply cut off from Ukrainian society through the imposition of repressive measures. Prohibition entailed the ideological distortion of permitted writers, the vivisection of the legacy of individual writers, the filtering process of themes and images that cultivated old imperial cliches in literature, such as folkloristic and uncultured elements as supposedly characteristic traits of Ukrainian identity. Literary figures and works were criminalized according to old imperial patterns, but in Soviet times, the accusation of separatism from Tsarist times translated into the accusation of bourgeois nationalism, and after the war into the accusation of fascism. This systematic distortion also applied to ancient literature. Until 1977, the study of ancient literature had been made impossible. But then, a truly remarkable school dedicated to the study of Ukrainian ancient texts was formed, although it had to operate in the face of incredible adversities. The very term Baroque was banned, one of the criteria for a writer to be deemed permissible was its atheism, which was a complete interpretive absurdity for the analysis of a period of non-secularized literature. Each edition of ancient texts immediately became a powerful driver for restoring national identity, which is why it was subject to strict censorship, as after all the historical works of writers in the 60s. In short, Ukraine was not meant to have a past. At the same time, ancient literature, mostly ecclesiastical texts, was highly complex and could have not left a significant impact on society in the same way as secular works in Western literature. Linguistic manipulations were a mirror for these processes. In Stalin's time, linguists who introduced Ukrainian words into Ukrainian Russian dictionaries that had no common root with Russian were shot dead. There was a whole group of forbidden words, and again this was primarily ancient vocabulary. Even the phoneme G, known in sources since at least the 14th century, was banned. Fundamentally, it was a case of linguicide, because none of the languages of the so-called socialist camp had undergone such a degree of ideologization. Summarily, during the Soviet occupation, two main phenomena, which provided the foundation for its European cultural identity, were effectively removed from Ukrainian literature. First, Baroque and modernism, and second, the legacy of Romantic literature that was distorted. Essentially, Ukrainian society was able to get acquainted with all the centuries old heritage of its country's literature only after 1991. And here comes the crisis. Society at large had been isolated from these phenomena for decades. The return of individual authors occurred very little during the thaw and during perestroika. Thus, the European models of Ukrainian literature have influenced Ukrainian society for a relatively short period of time. However, after the fall of the USSR, new phenomena emerged which hindered public reception. Firstly, social chaos, economic crisis, a flurry of desperate information channels, which paradoxically marginalized the role of culture compared to Soviet times. Secondly, Ukrainians had already access to a large array of literature, but did not have time to form adequate critical tools for selecting and understanding texts. In addition, various attractions entered the competition for people's attention. Everything became accessible and therefore less interesting. Thirdly, even the mechanism of Soviet political correctness, where measures of linguistic pressure had been exercised in a veiled form, ceased to work. On the contrary, in the post-Soviet period, openly anti-Ukrainian organizations were formed in Crimea, Donbas, and other Russified areas in Ukraine, which promoted propagandistic messages against any manifestations of Ukrainian identity, seen as a form of hostile Western influence. Two other important aspects are relevant for discussing the internal problems of Ukrainian studies, which have not yet succeeded in forming a new canon. The first aspect concerns the failure to establish a line of succession between this newly rediscovered literature and new trends. This gave rise to a new puzzle. Post-Soviet literature was declared postmodern, taking over most of the critical efforts, thereby leaving vast arrays of literature from the past understudied. As for the second aspect, the post-Soviet period was meant not only to restore the historical continuum of Ukraine's literary heritage as such, but also rebuild the entire humanitarian sphere, which had been completely dismantled during Soviet times. And this is an incredibly complex task which requires the efforts of specialists as well as the direct participation of society. The latter proved insufficient, thereby creating a window of opportunity for the introduction of new manipulative techniques that ensured the dominance of populism not only in the political sphere, but also in the cultural one. Of course, this is not only a Ukrainian phenomenon. That said, This trend proves to be especially destructive in a culture that has only recently started building its canon on the basis of the idea of European identity. Here we return to the idea of François Guizot mentioned at the beginning of this article. A literary phenomenon must rely on mechanisms that can facilitate its impact on society. In post-Soviet Ukraine, such mechanisms were not adequately supported. It is precisely for this reason that the case of Vachtan Kipiani's book on Vasil Stus, which embodies a synthesis of Soviet practices, is possibly in today's Ukraine. The first time, the great poet was convicted for studying the poetry of forbidden Tychina. The system appointed him Viktor Medvedchuk as his lawyer, who in those circumstances effectively played the prosecutor's role. Probably killed in the year of Perestroika, 1985, the poet was buried without a name under a number in the Perm camp. It was only with Gorbachev's permission that Stus was reburied in Ukraine. It is worth mentioning that Stus comes from Donbass. For decades, it had not been possible to name the Donetsk University after him. This changed in 2016, and only after part of the academic staff had moved to Vinica from the occupied territories. Today, his former lawyer, Medvedchuk, is the main leader of pro-Russian political forces in Ukraine. Recently, a court ordered the removal of any mention of Medvedchuk from Kipiani's book and a ban on its distribution without Medvedchuk's permission. Against this background, it is important to stress that this case represents not only a case of repression of freedom of thought and information, but also of the politicization of the work of one of the greatest modernists of European poetry in the 20th century. This case suggests that the unfinished revolution in the cultural sphere is no less dangerous than the unfinished revolution in politics. This is just one example of how difficult it is today to restore the European heritage of Ukrainian culture in Ukraine. To conclude, this state of affairs inevitably obstructs the integration of Ukrainian studies abroad into Western humanities broadly understood. Despite recurrent claims from Western academic circles regarding their complete non-involvement, this discipline is also affected by politics. It was only after Ukraine gained independence that Ukrainian studies abroad started developing in a systematic way. But even this development requires a long time, favorable contexts, and in a way, affirmative actions. Much has already been done, but we are only at the beginning of the process. Significant problems exist both on a practical and theoretical levels. From a practical point of view, we are witnessing a significant lack of instruments, textbooks, dictionaries, systematic translations. From a theoretical point of view, the continuum of Ukrainian literature has not been fully established, while its European identity continues to be the subject of intense discussions. Failure to address such practical and theoretical shortcomings will only further hinder the development of Ukrainian studies and the research around Ukrainian literature as an aesthetic phenomenon. For example, sporadic translations of modern literature, which has not been properly contextualized in the past tradition, risk being treated as sociological guides on Ukraine's contemporary problems rather than aesthetic products. Therefore, only the synergy of Ukrainian studies in Ukraine and abroad can bring to light the truly European nature of Ukrainian culture. If successful, such effort would generate positive changes within Slavic studies as a discipline in general. Perhaps in the climate of the total crisis of the democratic world today, it is not so important to prove that Ukraine is another kidnapped West. Arguably, the dualism of Western and Eastern Europe is becoming less and less relevant compared to the deepening of the civilizational gap between Europe and non-Europe. Therefore, Ukrainian literature, reinterpreted in this way, could provide an important contribution to the development of a pan-European dimension of culture. So this is it.
Thank you so much, Tereza. I will step in for a second to give you to breathe in and breathe out for a second. Thank you so much for this excellent reading, and many thanks to Professor Pachlovska for this really amazing text, which is panoramic in scope and gives us a very rich food for thought, because she raises a lot of important questions, and unfortunately we cannot pose them to Professor Pachlovska. However, we are in our own right to address them in the discussion. Therefore, I'm using this opportunity for you to engage with your questions and remarks in the chat right now. And then after the second presentation, we will discuss them. But now we are moving on to the second speaker.
Our second speaker is Mykola Riabchuk, and he's going to present his paper with a very intriguing title, White Skin, Black Language, Traumatic Experience of the Imperial Linguicide. But first of all, I would like to tell something, or I would like to say a few words about Mykola Riabchuk. Mykola Riabchuk studied history and literary theory in Moscow from 1985 to 1988. During the 90s, he co-edited the leading Ukrainian intellectual journals Sesvit, Současnost, and Kritika. Since 2012, he has been a senior research fellow at the Institute of Political and Nationality Studies of the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Riabchuk is honorary president of the Ukrainian Pen Center and jury head for the Angelus International Literary Award. His previous books include, for example, From Little Russia to Ukraine's Real Borders and Virtual Wars, or Post-Colonial Colonial Syndrome. And to move on, we will pass to Mykola Riabchuk's paper. Please, it's on you.
Thank you, Tereza, and thank you, Radomyr and Valeria, for engaging me in this very interesting project. I apologize for being late for some technical problems that popped up unexpectedly, but everything is for better, because we had the chance to listen to very extensive introduction to history of Ukrainian culture. 1,000 years of Ukrainian culture were presented in one paper, which was sometimes simplified but pretty informative and comprehensive. So it makes my task easier, because now I can move to some research questions and to problematizing of what was said. My topic, I changed a little bit my topic, or rather subtopic. Topic is the same, White Skin, Black Language, but I reformulated a subtitle. I refocused it from linguicide to more general issue of colonial subjugation, a more traumatic experience, because linguicide is just a part of this general much broader process. So the subtitle is a traumatic experience of colonial subjugation, the Ukrainian case. The title of my paper apparently refers to Frantz Fanon's classic book, Black Skin, White Masks, which was published in 1952, almost 70 years ago in Paris, and republished since then many times in many languages. Besides sheer intellectual provocation, I conceived the paper as an attempt to check the applicability of some Fanon's findings to the Ukrainian case, and actually to any quasi-colonial situation where no racial issues are seemingly involved. And secondly, my intention was to check the heuristic potential of such application, the added value of the hypothesizing and analysis carried out along Fanon's psychoanalytic lines. This makes me to proceed in 3 steps. First, I shall briefly introduce some Fanon's ideas that I consider the most promising and productive for the eventual research. Secondly, I shall argue why and to what degree the Ukrainian situation can be considered colonial, and in what sense the Ukrainian language can be seen as an analog to Fanon's black skin. And thirdly, I'll try to discuss some Ukraine's today's problems that I deem post-colonial, and to explain, with Fanon's help, their otherwise inexplicable persistence and salience. Because, you know, there are too little time to do all these things. I present the first part of my paper without major cuts, because it's rather new stuff. The second and the third part can be briefly outlined, can be compressed, because I touched these issues before, so it's not that new. In some forms were already presented in my writing. So let me start with rereading the classic with Frantz Fanon, a black-skinned French psychiatrist from French Antillean islands, from Martinique, who actually published only 2 books. The second one, The Wretched of the Earth, was actually translated into Ukrainian by leftist activists in Ukraine. I consider the first book more interesting, Black Skin, White Masks. And I try to apply some insights from this book to Ukrainian case and to check their productivity. So Fanon, in his 1952 book, attempted to deconstruct the mechanisms of colonial subjugation from the psychoanalytical perspective, drawing on his own medical experience with both white and black patients. He concluded that the encounter of white and black races was harmful psychologically for both sides. On the one side, it inculcated blacks with a deep inferiority complex, including widespread and highly traumatic self-hatred. And on the other side, it developed a superiority complex in whites, psychologically corrosive in its own way. Quote, the feeling of inferiority of the colonized is a correlative to the Europeans' feeling of superiority. Let us have the courage to say it outright. It is the racist who creates the inferior. So, being discarded by whites, the Aborigine alone no longer exists. He exists with the European. The arrival of the white man into some native land shattered not only its horizons, but logical mechanisms. An island like Madagascar, invaded overnight by pioneers of civilization, suffered the loss of its basic structure, the end of quotation. Frantz Fanon had felt intuitively what the cultural anthropologists would eventually substantiate in more detail, that any culture is homeostatic and therefore self-sufficient and full-fledged as long as it satisfies the needs of society in question. As a live organism and holistic entity, it should be judged primarily from within, and therefore cannot be defined as inferior, lower, or incomplete, as long as it functions well and serves the needs of its members properly. So, it is colonizers who bring the judgment from outside, impose their own criteria, project their civilizational matrix upon aborigines as allegedly higher and universal. Crucially, the cultural dominance and alleged superiority come not with Dante or Leonardo or Bach, since natives are fully satisfied with their traditional culture and barely value all the unsolicited import. The dominance comes with technology, primarily with arms and of course violence. It comes with everything that helps to subjugate the natives and enforce their obedience. Only then the notion of racial cum cultural superiority comes to the fore as a means to legitimize the conquest, to justify the mistreatment of natives, and to infect them with inferiority complex, that is, to subjugate them mentally. To put it simply, it is not a presumably higher culture that asserts superiority of whites over natives, but a sheer military force, social exclusion, and economic deprivation. To feel inferior, the native must look at himself through the eyes of the other, the Western eyes, to paraphrase Joseph Conrad. He must engage in a disastrous process of comparison, which means unfair competition on colonizers' terms. Native society, therefore, is a neurotic society, a society of comparison. The crucial point of Fanon's observation is that the natives not only learn to see themselves through the colonizer's eyes, but uncritically adopt their view, internalize it, accept as normal, with all its racist stereotypes and supremacist prejudices. They become, to paraphrase Jean-Paul Sartre's remark on the Jews, poisoned by the stereotype that others have on them. With the racist stereotypes, aborigines, according to Fanon, are battered down by tum-tums, cannibalism, intellectual deficiency, fetishism, racial defects, slave ships, and above all, mockery of their language. They have no culture, no civilization, no long historical past. This may be the reason for the strivings of contemporary Negroes to prove the existence of a black civilization to the white world as at all costs, which is quite familiar for Ukrainians who still are seeking their roots, their prehistorical Ori, Ari ancestors and so on. I continue quotation from Fanon. Willy-nilly, the Negro has to wear the livery that the white man has sewed for him. Natives are literally woven out by whites on 1,000 details, anecdotes, and stories. The end of quotation. School education, intertwined with the popular culture, plays, according to Fanon, a particular role in moral emasculation and intellectual subjugation of natives. There is a constellation of postulates, he wrote, a series of propositions that slowly and subtly, with the help of books, newspapers, schools, and their texts, advertisements, films, radio, work their way into one's mind to shape one's view of the world, of the group to which one belongs. The black schoolboy, who in his lessons is forever talking about our ancestors, the Gauls, identifies himself with the explorer, the bringer of civilization, the white man who carries truth to savages, and all white truth. There is identification, that is, the young Negro subjectively adopts a white man's attitude, the end of quotation. A key element of cultural psychological subjugation of natives is denigration of their languages. In schools, they are taught to scorn their dialect. Some families, quote, completely forbid the use of the native language, and mothers ridicule their children for speaking it. In some, as Fanon contends, every colonized people, every people in whose soul an inferiority complex has been created by the death and burial of its local cultural originality, finds itself face to face with the language of the civilizing nation, that is, with the culture of the metropole. The colonized is elevated above his jungle status in proportion to his adoption of the metropole's cultural standards. He becomes whiter as he renounces his blackness, his jungle. The end of quotation. Native language is an important element of his blackness, not necessarily the main or the only, as in the case of Ukrainians, but still conspicuous and vulnerable enough to all kinds of symbolical and occasionally physical aggression. It seems quite reasonable to get rid of that dangerous element, to hide it, to silence, to forget. The black man who arrives from France, from the colony, changes not only because it is from France that he received his knowledge of Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire, but also because France gave him his physicians, his department heads, his innumerable little functionaries like tax or military or police officers, and so on. Then, as he comes back home, he answers only in French, and often he no longer understands the local dialect. He talks about the opera, which he may never have seen except from a distance. But above all, he adopts a critical attitude toward his compatriots. The end of quotation. The situation is not unfamiliar for many Ukrainians who move from their villages to the urban centers, like from the internal colonies to the metropole, and then come back just to prove Frantz Fanon's observation that, quote, the same behavior patterns obtain in every race that has been subjected to colonization. But what is the origin of this personality change? What is the source of this new way of being? Fanon's answer is simple but harsh. They want to make themselves white, to compel the white man to acknowledge that they are human. And since every language is a way of thinking, the rejection of native tongue and adoption of the metropolitan pidgin is an evidence of dislocation, a separation. Quote, the Negro's inferiority complex is particularly intensified among the most educated, who must struggle with it incessantly, because they are almost white in their speech, in their culture and education, but cannot overcome the last remaining barrier, their colored skin that separates them from the white race of true humans. This places natives forever in combat with their own image, makes them to live in ambiguity that is extraordinarily neurotic, end of quote. But what about the whites who create the Negro, as Fanon puts it, who invent the alleged superiority of their race and impose it by multiple means upon the subjugated people? Fanon interprets the racist attitude through the analogy of the anti-Semitic mentality. He invokes Jean-Paul Sartre's definition of anti-Semitism as a poor man's snobbery. Quote, it is propagated mainly among middle classes because they possess neither land, nor house, nor castle. By treating the Jew as an inferior and pernicious being, they affirm at the same time that they belong to the elite. The end of quote. This entails, however, another kind of ambiguity, aptly noticed by Homi Bhabha. Quote, in demanding turn white or disappear, colonizer is himself caught in the ambivalence of paranoid identification, alternating between fantasies of megalomania and persecution. The end of quote. Fanon draws on the concept of Carl Gustav Jung, who consistently identifies the foreign with the obscure, with the tendency to evil. Quote, this mechanism of projection, or if one prefers transference, has been described by classic psychoanalysis in degree to which I find in myself something unheard of, something reprehensible, Fanon explains. Only one solution remains for me: to get rid of it, to ascribe its origin to someone else. In this way, I eliminate a short circuit that threatens to destroy my equilibrium. Projecting his own desires onto the Negro, the white man behaves as if the Negro really had them. I would say this also sounds very familiar for Ukrainians who hear incessant cries on forcible Ukrainization and not always understand them as another projection of colonizers' complexes, where the fantasy of persecution is merely a reverse side of the fantasy of megalomania, that is, of the imaginary belonging to Ruski Mir and its alleged cultural, civilizational supremacy. But let's proceed with Fanon. The fact that reality destroys those beliefs matters little because they are not contingent on the reality. They all rest on the level of the imagined, on that of paralogism, which is quite typical for any mythical thought. Fanon employs the Jungian term of collective consciousness and collective unconsciousness, but interprets it in a more rational way, without falling back on the genes or cerebral heredity or fuzzy notion of archetype. For him, it is purely and simply the sum of prejudices, myths, collective attitudes of a given group, the result of what I shall call the unreflected imposition of a culture. Just that simple. This explains, inter alia, the persistence of colonial complexes and stereotypes in a post-colonial society long after the underlying political, social, and economic conditions subsided or even disappeared. The collective unconsciousness still reproduces them at the level of both social norms and cultural habits. They may endure incessantly if the structural social economic inequality inherited from colonialism still supports them, as actually is the case of Ukraine. So this is the end of my first chapter. And I have two more chapters, which of course cannot be presented here because they are as long as the first one. So I'll try to outline briefly at least some paragraphs. So in the second chapter, I discuss the issue of colonialism, whether Ukraine could be seen as a colony. In other words, whether Fanon's findings can be somehow applied to Ukraine. The issue of Ukraine's coloniality is, for some people, is obvious because Ukraine was politically subjugated. Ukraine was subjected to all kinds of repression, of genocides, and so on, of denationalization, and so on. But there are also counter arguments, and these counter arguments boil down to actually two points. One argues that Ukrainians actually were not colonized because they were, in fact, co-creators of the empires. They participated in the imperial projects. They were co-owners of the empire because they occupied the top positions in both Russian Empire and Soviet Empire. They could make any career in both empires. So basically, Russian and Soviet empires were as much or almost as much Ukrainian as Russian were. So it's this is how argument goes. This argument confuses actually two different things. One of them, creation of the Russian Empire, when Ukrainians really played a very important role, and actually the intention of Ukrainian intellectuals who participated in empire building under Peter the Great auspices was really to be shareholders. They invented this idea of Little Rus and Great Rus, and they considered that their contribution, their share was small in quantitative terms, but in qualitative terms it was huge because it alluded to small Greece, to little Greece. So it was a cradle of Rus civilization and so on. They played this game. They rather naively they expected that they would be treated equally with great Russians. Of course, they failed, and they were downgraded to Little Russia, not in all possible terms, like a province of Russia. So this early period ended very, very, very soon. It didn't last long, and since then, of course, Ukrainians indeed participated in the empire building, but only to a degree to which they renounced their Ukrainians. They had to. So it was, Russian Empire as well as Soviet Empire was quite inclusive. Anybody could participate, could be engaged as soon as anybody accepted the dominant language, culture, religion in Russian Empire, or communist ideology in the Soviet Empire. Actually, everybody had to become loyal subject of the empire, and all the roads upstairs were open for these people. And so not little surprise that many Ukrainians advanced in both empires, occupied some positions, but to what degree they were Ukrainians, actually. They were just loyal subjects of the empire of some Ukrainian origin, but they were people of Georgian origin, of Jewish origin, and so on. But none of them made this empire Georgian or Jewish or Tatar or whatever. It was Russian empire. It was Soviet Russian empire. So Ukrainians also didn't play any decisive role. And what is importantly, they also didn't make the situation of their compatriots any easier. Ukrainians as a group were oppressed. So this very subtle dialectics. Ukrainians as individuals were not oppressed in the Russian or Soviet Empire. But as a group, they were oppressed very harshly. They were subjected to denationalization, sometimes to extermination, and so on. This should be distinguished. You could pass for white, and many Ukrainians passed for white, but who failed to pass was, of course, had to feel the wrath of empire very, very seriously. So much about this, alleged co-ownership and participation in the empire building, but also there was another argument which dismissed my comparison between black skin and black language. I argued that Ukrainian language was a sort of stigma. It was a subject of contempt. It was subject of ridiculing and so on and so on. And of course, quite naturally, Ukrainians had to quite naturally, they would like to get rid of it, to become whites. And it was much easier, of course, for them than for Africans, for Fanon's compatriots. This, was, of course, it was imposed by social economic systems, because Ukrainians were enslaved in Russian Empire. They were enslaved, de facto enslaved in the Soviet kolkhozes. So they represented a lesser world, in say its terms, kind of subhuman race of rural bumpkins, or lower caste of kolkhoz slaves. They were ghettoized in their wretched villages. They were paid in kind, if paid at all, and deprived even of ID cards, the so-called internal passports. They were deprived of possibility to move everywhere. They were locked in this, in this ghettos, rural ghettos. So of course they represented this backwardness, and of course this image of backwardness was projected upon everything. The Ukrainian language also was part of this backwardness. Even the language which colonizers employed to slur the natives had clear racialist underpinnings, as it evokes either non-human, animalistic, or subhuman, morally weak or mentally disordered images. These slurs. Natives are vilified as either Beki, Kuguty, Raguli, Kolkhoz, or as Жлоби, Mavnyuki, Banderi, Nationalno Zabochene, and so on. So maybe I would translate it later, but the very idea is that all these adjectives, all these words signify something subhuman, something inferior. This, of course, counter arguments goes that that province everywhere in any country, especially in the Soviet Union, became a kind of internal colony. It's a universal phenomenon. But again, yes, I agree that Russian province was also mistreated by the center as an internal colony. But there was substantial difference between these two kinds of internal colonies, because the plight of inhabitants in Ukraine, of rural inhabitants, was absolutely different. In Russia, besides this rural quasi third world, there was also the quasi first world of the big cities, primarily of Moscow and Leningrad, where the native language and culture could flourish, or at least to stood alive, despite all ideological limitations. Something that was absolutely impossible in Kiev, where all the things modern, cultured, prestigious had to be Russian. Things Ukraine had to be only folkloristic, very archaic, ethnographic. So, you know, this makes the process of passing for white very different for Russian and Ukrainian peasants. While, you know, Russian peasants just needed to polish a bit their language and that's all. The Ukrainian peasants were forced to change language completely, which meant a profound damage for the entire worldview informed by the language, and for the identity broken by the request for self-hatred. Finally, if I have a few more minutes, I would try to elucidate briefly the last point about today's Ukraine, about persistence of this, you know, colonial relations or quasi-colonial relations in today's Ukraine. I interpret Ukraine's state as a kind of Creole state, a state which was ruled, historically was ruled by colonial elite, either imported from Russia or recruited from assimilated natives. But basically, all this elite, which inherited the Ukrainian state in 1991, was, I would say, 99% Russian speaking and Russian thinking. But they were smart enough to make pact with natives who represented democratic opposition at that time, and privatized a huge chunk of the empire with very rich resources. The result of this pact was outsourcing of some governmental positions to natives, like Minister of Culture or Education, which are not beneficial. They don't bring much rent for the ruling elite. So ruling elite is not much interested in this. So some symbolical concessions could be done, like anthem, flag, and so on. But generally, the control of the state, basic control of main positions, and primarily of economy, is in the hands of the post-communist Creole type elite. And to understand the essence of this elite, and therefore what kind of state they are building, you may take a look more precisely at their who are these people. Unfortunately, we don't have in Ukraine any, you know, comprehensive sociological study of this elite, like that was which was done, for example, in Russia by Olga Kryshtanovskaya. But we can rely on our daily observations, and we can argue that Ukraine, 3 decades after independence, still is ruled by post-colonial Creole type elite that opportunistically opted for the secession from Moscow, and still retains dominance in state governance and administration, firmly shot up by total control, actually capture of the economy. Having no sociological data on the language practices and preferences of Ukrainian elite, we can rely on another valuable source. Their informal conversations recorded covertly or intercepted in phones and publicized by journalists, mostly within the framework of oligarchic turf wars. The largest collection of such conversations come from the famous or infamous Melnichenko tapes from 1999. And there are many more records of this kind, which appeared eventually in Ukraine until recently. And all of them, 99% at least, of these conversations are carried out in Russian. These are conversations, of voices of politicians, top politicians, top businessmen, judges, prosecutors, mayors, ministers, and so on, so on. There are even 2 closed sessions of the cabinet of ministers recorded in a pretty good quality. 99% of them are carried out in Russian, and in most cases it's not just Russian, but a semi-criminal slang full of swear words, toilet humor, and thorough cynicism related to both the state affairs and their own duties. Any language, and this is my last point, any language is a worldview, and the language of Ukrainian elite is a clear expression of the Slovak mentality, the same style that you may discern in Putin jokes or Lukashenko's grumblings. The policies of this kind of elite had been highly opportunistic from the very beginning, or as they say, pragmatic. They pursued 2 interrelated goals: to draw the rent wherever possible, as it was the main goal of their national independence, and to keep a delicate balance between the passionate natives who demanded Europeanization that included unacceptable for the ruling elite rule of law, and the conservative petty colonizers, the orphans of Belovezha forest, as the Hungarian publicist has aptly labeled them, more or less skillfully manipulating both groups. So I have also some, prescription or some actually forecast for the future, how this vicious post-colonial vicious circle can be broken out, if at all. But I would spare this probably for the next discussion, or maybe for I can send actually you my paper at your request if you are interested in. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Riabchuk. And I don't know, Valeria, how much time do we have left?
We had to finish by 6:30, I believe. We had 1 hour and a half. So I took half an hour.
No. Thank you so much. That was a brilliant presentation. I would suggest, if you have some time, to take another half an hour with us, and then we just cut short the coffee break. But it's up to you, because we cannot violate your schedule.
I can answer your questions, but or at least I can present here 2 paragraphs which actually are sort of conclusions. So if you don't mind, because I omitted one issue which I skipped here one issue of persistent humiliation of Ukrainian speakers. It's a very widespread phenomenon. Today, because of digital technology, we have opportunity to have recorded this conflicts, and there are a lot of them. You will find a lot of examples in the media, starting from this notorious clash with Odessa police officer who called Ukrainian call language, and until recent humiliation of schoolgirl who was humiliated by school teacher just because this girl dared to respond in Ukrainian school, by the way. It's kind of Potemkin Ukrainization in Ukrainian schooling. That's another matter. So I interpret this attacks, this very irrational attacks of this petty colonizers against Ukrainian speech, as Sartre did. It's a poor man's snobbery. This is the only way for them to feel themselves superior to somebody, at least to somebody, to this poor Ukrainian blacks who are still, demanding something. They still are, showing off. They are выпендриваются. This is a substantial part of my second chapter, but since you allow me to give me a few minutes more, I just would read conclusions. There are 2 paragraphs of my conclusion. This attempt to answer the question whether there is any way out from this post-colonial vicious circle. So my answer is that the chances to break this vicious circle without a comprehensive external support, as it happened in a rather similar situation in the Balkans, are very slim. Nonetheless, the general pattern of such breakthroughs implies that they largely depend on the emergence of middle class, la bourgeoisie, as the only group that has a vested interest in democracy, constitutionalism, nation building, and rule of law. Their project of nation building should not necessarily be native-based and native-driven, as a case of Americas or Ireland or today's Belarus suggests. In all these cases, nation building can be accomplished or is being accomplished by settlers or assimilated natives. But their commitment to rule of law gives a good chance anyway to accommodate the interests and assuage the grievances of both groups within the prosperous, legal, and future-oriented state. This is the only hope. And secondly, this last but not least, as to the specific problems of Ukraine-speaking, non-assimilated natives, we may come back again to Frantz Fanon and his illuminating book, quote, as a psychoanalyst, I should help my patient to become conscious of his unconscious and abandon his attempts at a hallucinatory whitening, but also to act in the direction of a change in the social structure. If in his dreams, I establish the expression of an unconscious desire to change color, my objective will not be that of dissuading him from it, but advising him to keep his place. By advising him to keep his place. On the contrary, my objective, once his motivations have been brought into consciousness, will be to put him in a position to choose action with respect to the real source of the conflict, that is, towards the social structures. The effective delineation of the black man entails an immediate recognition of social and economic realities. If there is an inferiority complex, it is the outcome of a double process. A, primarily economic, B, subsequently the internalization of this inferiority. What is important is not to educate them, the racist, but to teach the Negro not to be the slave of their archetypes. That's the end of quotation. And I believe that what is very, very, very good, very truthful in these comments, these advices, is to pay more attention to social economic structures, which largely determines all other relations. As long as we have in Ukraine, the richest and the most influential 1,000 or 10,000 people who never speak Ukrainian, you would hardly persuade the majority of these poor blacks to take seriously all this, Potemkin Ukrainization and so on. As long as we fail to provide services, basic services in all spheres of life, in all regions of Ukraine, for Ukrainian speakers in their own language, there is no reason to recognize the state, at least by natives, as their own state. This is very, very serious problem. So we may label this. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
All good.
Something?
No, all good.
That's okay. No, I just wanted to say that all this talks about forcible Ukrainization are missing the point, because actually what the natives demand is not to, they don't want to Ukrainize anybody. They just want to have to be served in Ukrainian for their own money, in their own country, in their own language. That's all. They don't care about other languages. They don't care about how Russians speak or whoever speaks. They just want to have basic services. They have basic respect in Odessa, in Kiev, and so on, for their own money. It's not something impossible. It has to provide services in restaurants, in transport, in stores, and so on and so on. It's not so difficult. It's quite possible. But there is huge resistance. Even intellectuals in Ukraine. I know a lot of my friends, Russian-speaking friends, who say yes, but we understand the problem, but it's maybe too much. We shouldn't, because everybody understands Russian, so why should you demand? No, it's not a matter of understanding. It's a matter of respect. It's a matter of of overcoming all this colonial trauma, all this colonial tradition, all this colonial humiliation, of superiority, of this poor man's snobbery, which still is alive and well. And you can discover this maybe not so much in Kiev, but go to Odessa, go to Donetsk, go to Kharkiv. Okay, so I would stop here. I talk too much. And, thank you.
We have one question from the audience.
And also,
yes, I see. I see the question.
Sorry?
Yes, let me.
So maybe we will read it so everyone hears.
Oh yes, please read it. Yes.
Could you polemize on the possible sources of racism as a response to the Black Lives Matter protests that was quite widespread within Ukrainian diasporas? Apparently, the exposure to multiculturalism and experience of racially diverse societies of the host countries did not work as a vaccine to it. Thank you.
I cannot comment on Ukrainian diaspora, but I am not well acquainted with this. I know some people from Ukrainian diaspora. They are very bright intellectuals, and I don't suspect they share any kind of racist views. And I can talk about all the diaspora. It's very diverse, probably, as well as Ukrainians here in Ukraine. What I feel, what I observe here in Ukraine, that many Ukrainians follow very often the Russian line of dismissing this anti-racist protests in America and elsewhere in the West. But probably it's not only Russian influence, even though it's very strong. It's Russian propaganda, especially in social media, is very powerful. But I believe that also there could be also some internal some subconscious racist views among Ukrainians. Why not? They could be oppressed themselves, but also they can internalize a lot of these ugly complexes. But also, it might be also one more reason that Ukrainians still, cannot accept this, situation of being equaled or compared to racially different people, to racially oppressed people. Still, Ukrainians claim we are Europeans. We would like to, our culture is European. We had very strong European tradition. We would like to integrate, join European Union, NATO, and so on. So suddenly somebody tells them, well, folks, yes, but your language is black language. It's treated as language. It's a stigma. It's a source of contempt. And it's very difficult for them to accept them. It's a kind of dissonance emerges between their intentions as European visions and quite a brutal reality of de facto marginalized people in formerly, nominally independent state. So that's a problem.
May I step in? Tereza, yeah. Well, thank you so much for your emotional intervention. As an organizer, I'm first very happy to have you on board, because from my perspective, you are one of the most prominent post-colonial scholars moving it beyond literary studies. No, seriously, and that's why I'm addressing, and yes, another remark as an organizer, maybe I will use an opportunity to ask for your text. Maybe you would be generous enough to publish it with us. It would be nice to have something as an outcome of this conference, right? And then everyone will have a chance to read it through, because indeed, I think it's worth reading. What I wanted to ask you, and maybe it's a nice bridge to that question, that's, this sort of psychological deficiency of being in this structure of oppression does not result into the solidarity with other oppressed people, like with this Black Lives Matter, but with the desire to compensate by oppressing others, right? And that's very common. And that brings me to my question, where is this border, if you wish, between the fixing of the post-colonial situation and misusing or getting stuck in this colonial complex? Because even comparing with Poland, which you are very much familiar with, right? post-colonial theories in Poland, they use exactly the same terminology, but whom they call the Creoles, the pro-Western liberals, right? They call them fake Polish people trading their motherland. And that's why if we keep talking and fixing on this indeed awful situation and all these cases which you are referring to, we create a very dangerous situation that getting stuck there, we will start blaming everyone. And that creates a very unhealthy life attitude. So on one way, I very much sympathize with your claims, and I do agree with many of the diagnoses you pose here. But at the same time, shall we think further on what is the political misuse and the lasting effect of keeping talking about that?
No, I fully agree with you that we should be very careful with all this, labeling, othering, and so on. So all the time I make some reservations, and explain that I don't mean this, I mean that, and so on. Secondly, I try to promote these ideas and views mostly in academic context, not in popular. I avoid, at least in the past decade, I avoid this sort of publicistica. So I hope that people who read academic texts can better understand what's about. But you're right, absolutely right, that these concepts can be misused and terminology can be misused and so on. Yes, and I remember we had a lot of debates here in Ukraine about Black Lives Matter in Ukraine. I remember how Volodya Kulik was attacked by his friends that who followed, as I mentioned, they followed Russian line, and they tried to represent all these protests as some sort of violence and some uncontrolled, chaotic uprisings, which actually is very similar to how Ukraine Maidan was represented in the West. Also, as some.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree, and thank you for your remark. Yes, just a good reminder that we should be very careful. We should make a lot of caveats
and however, but to support your point, I would say that it's not only about Fanon, so it's not only about African and Asian decolonization, but also we have Latin America. And just recently I was listening to Walter Mignolo, and he was saying that being an Argentinian coming in the US, he is a blonde guy with blue eyes, a white man, so he does not have black skin, but once he speaks, his accent others him. And I think it's a very interesting parallel to the Ukrainian case, because when Ukrainians even made it to high offices in Moscow, they kept being ridiculed as ho-holes because they had this funny Ukrainian or Malorossian accent. So yes, many parallels could be played out here. And if I'm not abusing here, maybe to refer to Professor Pachlovska presentation, but also I think it unites your both presentation. I feel like in my own right to defend Kundera here, if you wish, because right now we are in the facility of Charles University, and I was listening to your talk just 2 days ago, and you were referring to the same essay, The Tragedy of Central Europe, and Professor Pachlovska recalled exactly the same line of argument that Kundera excludes Ukraine out of this family of Central European nation, which is not doing justice to Milan Kundera, because on the first page, in the third footnote, he says that the big Ukrainian nation of 52 million people of Ukrainians are being extinguished in front of our eyes, and that's a catastrophe. So he refers to that, and he says that Ukrainians are a big European nation. So it's not the case of exclusion in this particular respect. That's just a remark.
No. My attitude to Kundera is more subtle, because I recognize that his essay played very important role at the time. But in 1990s, when unfortunately this essay and these arguments were used in very bad-looking competition between different East European nations for joining European structures, Euro-Atlantic structures. It was very untasty competition. Who is more European? Who deserves more freedom? Who deserves, to occupy better places in the first class wagon and second class wagon and so on. So it's not fault of Kundera's fault. It's fault of eventual misuse of his concepts of his approach.
Yeah, that's true, but it was not his argument here. But I read a nice article said by the Czech writer, I would not give a name, saying alone in Europe or all together to the Balkans. Sort of that the Czechs are the most European, but if we join Eastern Europe, then we all end up somewhere in the.
He created impressions that the Iron Curtain should not be destroyed completely, but just removed from the western border of Czechoslovakia to eastern border of Czechoslovakia. This is how many Ukrainians feel it, or to southern, because he also excluded Balkans. He considered only the Central European as privileged land, which is really European. So there are some, weak points in this, and there's nothing wrong to criticize this essay. But of course, it should be praised and valued as a very important document of the time, very important attempt to challenge Russian Soviet dominance, and it played very important role, I believe, for Central East Europe, for mobilization, intellectual mobilization. Yeah.
That's true, yeah, but that brings to the first point about the solidarity of the oppressed, rather this sort of re-hierarchization, which is a very dangerous undertaking, right? Okay, so we have another remark asking about your book. I think that you have published a lot on the matter.
I think.
I can. What can I tell? As to my Fanon studies, they are not published yet. This is just article in progress, and it's not completed yet. But as soon as I finish it, I can send you copies, and I hope to publish it. So far, I publish Kundera's article is forthcoming in Aspen Review in #1 next year. And 2 books are forthcoming in English. One of them is already printed by Ibidem Verlag as a Fence of Metternich's Garden. It's available in catalog, and you may take a look at this book. The other one is forthcoming but not ready yet in Warsaw, in the University of Warsaw. It's based on my lectures delivered annually in the Center for East European Studies of Warsaw University. So it's sort of kind of textbook. And collection of essays is forthcoming in Ukrainian. Who reads in Ukrainian? It's forthcoming in Видавництво Старого Лева under provocative title Lexicon Nationalista, Nationalist Lexicon. But it could be called also Cosmopolitan's Lexicon. It's
But I wonder, since I have not read on your Fanon's reading what you started with, this methodological premise, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it occurred to me that you are suggesting to this bad myth of a primitive society, this like the opposite myth of a perfect society, of this, it reminds me of Tolstoy musings or Rousseau's musings of simple life or peasant's life. It's sort of idealization, because when you are talking about a society which is self-sustainable and serving their people, there are no hermetic societies, and no society, no polity serves completely their people. So just like your starting point is a very fragile theorization.
Yes and no. I recognize that no society, no country is an island. Yes, no civilization is an island. But maybe I should make more clear difference between some, violent imposition of other civilization, alien civilization, and gradual diffusion of influences, of impacts. We should distinguish these things. Of course, we are not isolated. Nobody is isolated. But when other ideas, other impacts, influences are gradually absorbed, selectively absorbed by society in question, it's one thing. But when local traditions are completely broken and something is imposed from outside by force, and entrenched forcibly, it's of course it's very serious psychological shock. So yeah.
If I can have a remark, I think it can be inspiring. At least it reminded me of Hrabovich's interpretation of Kotlereshchina. There is a similar concept of the necessity to accept the culture from within and not from outside matrices. So yeah, I think it can work very well if imposed on, for example, 19th century situation. So I think it's not so I think it's not fragile at all. I would consider it as a system or concept that can be used very well. Maybe not for today so much, but for sure for past 19th century is a good example. And I remember that the Hrabovich's essay was very, very useful for me because he works with those within outside systems, stereotypes, and judging from within, judging from outside projections, and I think it can be very useful. So I would agree with this, and it seemed to me very interesting what you said in the beginning of the paper.
It's very good point, and I'm glad that you here referred to Professor Grabovich, because there was even much earlier publication by Grabovich when his polemics with Czyżewski, with Czyżewski's idea of complete incomplete cultures, and Grabovich argues that you cannot tell some culture is completely incomplete.
Because Czyżewski takes it like genres and some structures, and Hrabovich takes this from within, from inside, and
like 10 years earlier.
This is it. Thank you.
But what about, if I may, like the last question, because indeed I just want to finish this conversation. When you are talking about violent imposition of something, what about the economic power, and what about the role of global capital and Europe? Because how does it play? Because you know that a lot of post-colonial studies are sort of merging with Wallerstein world system analysis and saying that basically Europe is the elephant in the room, and while we are periphery colony, then Russia is empire colony. So there are always three in this game, and that creates a very specific, like, economic violence versus political violence. So how do you play? Does it have a place in your vision?
This is what I'd like to emphasize in my essay, and actually I emphasize these passages in italics in my text about social economic relations, because they are fundamental. They actually reproduce neo-colonial situation in Ukraine today. I mentioned this, neo-colonial character of today's Ukrainian oligarchy and so-called ruling elite. But it's based on very specific economic. It's based on capture actually of Ukrainian economy by this post-Soviet elite, and they still are quite happy. And I'm glad that you mentioned Wallerstein here, which is again it's another paradox that he's a very bright thinker. But not nobody, but he still is not taken seriously, especially in this part of the world. He's just rejected as a crazy leftist or something like this. Well, he might be leftist, but not all leftists, not all Marxists are crazy. Some things they say are very, 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 very wise, I must say. And his image, his presentation of world economy is absolutely, from my point of view, is very persuasive. It's very reasonable. It explains a lot of in today's world, in today's crises, in all kinds of crises in today's world. They are stem from this initial perversion of world economy since 16th century, maybe. But it's another matter. But yes, you're absolutely right. I'd like to emphasize once again that the essence of this post-colonial situation in Ukraine, which seems to be just cultural, linguistic, and so it's social economic. It's underlying problem, and as long as it's not solved,
we are suggested to wrap up with a case of successful Ukrainization, because there is a question from Natalia Churikova, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So have you studied the roots of successful Ukrainization? Who, why, and how accepted Ukrainian identity, including the switch to the Ukrainian language?
Well, I argued that, you know, so far Ukrainization is, I call it Potemkin Ukrainization. It proceeds in Ukraine because there are some government measures, there are some laws and so on. But as you know, they are not implemented, or they are implemented very lukewarmly. Either, you know, there are a lot of, for example, there is a law which requires all the government officials to use Ukrainian in official situations, but they don't. You have Minister Avakov, and you have a lot of such guys like Avakov. They don't care about law. You have this law about Ukrainian education, but most of these so-called Ukrainian schools, either in Odessa or elsewhere in Southeast, they are Ukrainian on paper, because Ukraine is used in some lessons, in some classes, but not all of them, and it's absolutely not used in beyond classes, either by teachers or pupils and so on. So again, this Odessa incident is very graphical in this regard. It happened in Ukrainian school, it's not, you know, somewhere, but, you know, the pupil responded to teacher in Ukrainian school, you know, school with Ukrainian language of education, and was attacked, very brutally attacked. She was humiliated publicly by the teacher. So there's so much about, you know, about the so-called Ukrainization, which is, and there are a lot of these requirements for mass media, which are also technically, there are some figures, but they are never met properly, these figures, and so on. So I feel that my understanding is that the ruling elite, which is, as I described, basically doesn't pay much attention to all these issues. They made some concessions to natives because, you know, it's not beneficial for them. They have no profit from all these, you know, cultural issues. It's not source of rent. So they are ready to make concessions to give culture education to natives, but without money. So please do whatever you wish. You may some Ukrainianize something, but, you know, we don't care. So natives are happy because they have all these nice laws and more and more Ukrainian schools, etc. But the main goal of the ruling elite is rent seeking, to loot the country. They loot the country perfectly. I must say, you know, I observe all governments which are changed. Luckily we have new presidents, new governments, but basically they do the same. In different ways. So situation is rather ambiguous. It's not as bad as, for example, it was in Belarus, when Lukashenko completely oppressed and completely marginalizes, you know, Belarusian-speaking natives, aborigines. In Ukraine, it's not so easy because they are much more numerous and more vociferous, and they have much more strong symbolical capital. And actually, ruling elite needs some symbolical capital. They need to legitimize their rules. They need to represent themselves as the heirs of a historically powerful state since Kiev and Rus. And so they need all these historical myths. They need some elite which promotes this mythology. Absolutely. So there is a very peculiar symbiosis which requires special research. It's not that simple that, you know, that nice natives and bad ruling elite. Of course, no, it's much more complicated. But the general scheme is like this, you know. True. It's presented.
Okay, I'm asking Tereza probably to wrap up because we exhausted all possible time, but thank you for being so generous with your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Tereza?
much. So the rest of the questions and comments we will leave out, yeah?
No, I think pretty much we tackled on them, and we just passed to Professor Pachlovska this recommendation of some sources, because it's not a remark, but rather sort of a recommendation. So what I'm suggesting, if you do not mind, first of all, we thank Tereza Chlaňová for the moderation and for reading the first paper and helping us out with this situation. Thank you so much. And thank you, Mykola Riabchuk, for his challenging presentation and being again so generous and taking another half an hour to talk with us. And I want to thank our audience for its patience and being with us, although we violated the schedule. So what I'm suggesting, how we proceed from here, that we just immediately follow with the next panel without a coffee break. And taking the advantage of the virtual meeting, you can take your own personal break for 5 minutes whenever it feels right to you. So let me close this panel and start opening